Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family: Anna, Joe, M, David, Chris, Natasha, and Krista. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive episodes heard nowhere else, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, let's relax with a little bit about the craft world with Art in Needlework, a book about embroidery by Louis F. Day, author of Windows, Alphabets, Nature in Ornament, and other textbooks of ornamental design, and Mary Buckle. First published in 1900 by B.T. Batsford, 94 High Holborn, London. Let's begin. Preface. Embroidery may be looked at from more points of view than it would be possible in a book like this to take up seriously. Merely to hover round the subject and glance casually at it would serve no useful purpose. It may be as well, therefore, to define our standpoint. We look at the art from its practical side, not, of course, neglecting the artistic, for the practical use of embroidery is to be beautiful. The custom has been, since woman learnt to kill time with the needle, to think of embroidery too much as an idle accomplishment. It is more than that. At the very least, it is a handicraft. At the best, it is an art. This contention may be to take it rather seriously, but if one esteemed it less, it would hardly be worth writing about, and the book, when written, would not be worth the attention of students of embroidery, needleworkers, and designers of needlework to whom it is addressed. It sets forth to show what decorative stitching is, how it is done, and what it can do. It is illustrated by samplers of stitches, by diagrams to explain the way stitches are done, and by examples of old and modern work to show the artistic application of the stitches. A feature in the book is the series of samplers, designed to show not only what are the available stitches, but the groups into which they naturally gather themselves, as well as to the use to which they may be put. And the back of the sampler is given too. The reader has only to turn the page to see the other side of the stitching, which to a needlewoman is often the more helpful. Lest that should not be enough, the stitches are described in the text, and a marginal note shows at a glance where the description is given. This should be read needle and thread in hand, or skipped. Samplers and other examples of needlework are uniformly on a scale large enough to show the stitch quite plainly. The examples of old work illustrate always, in the first place, some point of workmanship. Still, they are chosen with some view to their artistic interest. In other respects, art is not overlooked, but it is art in harness. Design is discussed with reference to stitch and stuff with reference to their use in ornament. It has been endeavored also to show the effect needlework has had upon pattern, and the ways in which design is affected by the circumstance that it is to be embroidered. The joint authorship of the work needs perhaps a word of explanation. This is not just a man's book on a woman's subject. The scheme of it is mine, and I have written it, but with the cooperation throughout of Miss Mary Buckle. Our classification of the stitches is the result of many a conference between us. The description of the way the stitches are worked and so forth is my rendering of her description, supplemented by practical demonstration with the needle. She has primed me with technical information and been always at hand to keep me from technical error. With reference to design and art, I speak for myself. My thanks are due to the authorities at South Kensington for allowing us to handle the treasures of the National Collection and to photograph them for illustration, to Mrs. Walter Crane, Miss Mabel Keeley, and Miss C. P. Shrewsbury for permission to reproduce their handiwork, to Miss Argles, Mrs. Buxton Morrish, Colonel Green, R.E., and Messrs. Morris & Co. for the loan of work belonging to them, and to Miss Chart for working the cross-stitch sampler. I must also acknowledge the part my daughter has had in the production of this book. Without her constant help, it could never have been written. Louis F. Day, January 1st, 1900. Art in Needlework, Embroidery and Stitching. Embroidery begins with the needle, and the needle, thorn, fishbone, or whatever it may have been, came into use so soon as ever savages had the wit to sew skins and things together to keep themselves warm. Modesty, we may take it, was an afterthought, and if the stitches made any sort of pattern, as coarse stitching naturally would, that was embroidery. The term is often vaguely used to denote all kinds of ornamental needlework, and some with which the needle has nothing to do. That is misleading, though it is true that embroidery does touch, on the one side, tapestry, which may be described as a kind of embroidery with the shuttle, and on the other, lace, which is needlework pure and simple, construction in the air, as the Italian name has it. The term is used in common parlance to express any kind of superficial or superfluous ornamentation. A poet is said to embroider the truth, but such metaphorical use of the word hints at the real nature of the work, embellishment, enrichment, added. If added, there must first of all be something it is added to, the material, that is to say, on which the needlework is done. In weaving, even tapestry weaving, the pattern is got by the interthreading of warp and weft. In lace, too, it is got out of the threads which make the stuff. In embroidery, it is got by threads worked on a fabric first of all woven on the loom, or it might be netted. There is inevitably a certain amount of overlapping of the crafts. For instance, take a form of embroidery common in all countries, Eastern, Hungarian, or nearer home, in which certain of the weft threads of the linen are drawn out, and the needlework is executed upon the warp threads thus revealed. This is, strictly speaking, a sort of tapestry with the needle. Just as it was explained, tapestry itself may be described as a sort of embroidery with the shuttle. That will be clearly seen by reference to illustration 1, which shows a fragment of ancient tapestry found in a Coptic tomb in Upper Egypt. In the lower portion of it, the pattern appears light on dark. As a matter of fact, it was wrought in white and red upon a linen warp. But as it happened, only the white threads were of linen, like the warp. The red were woolen, and in the course of 1,500 years or so, much of this red wool has perished, leaving the white pattern intact on the warp, the threads of which are laid bare in the upper part of the illustration. It is on just such upright lines of warp that all tapestry, properly so called, is worked. Whether with the shuttle or with the needle makes no matter, and there is good reason, therefore, for the name of tapestry stitch, to describe needlework upon the warp threads only of a material, usually linen, from which some of the weft threads have been withdrawn. The only difference between true tapestry and drawn work, an example of which is here given, is that the one is done on a warp that has not before been woven upon, and the other on a warp from which the weft threads have been drawn. The distinction, therefore, between tapestry and embroidery is that worked on a warp, as in illustration 1, it is tapestry. Worked on a mesh, as in illustration 3, it is embroidery. With regard again to lace, that is itself a web, independent of any groundwork or foundation to support it, but it is possible to work it over a silken or other surface, and there is a kind of embroidery which only floats on the surface of the material without penetrating it. A fragment of last century silk, given in illustration 35, shows plainly what is meant. Embroidery is enrichment by means of a needle. To embroider is to work on something. A groundwork is presupposed, and we usually understand by embroidery needlework in thread. It may be wool, cotton, linen, silk, gold, no matter what, upon a textile material, no matter what. In short, it is the decoration of a material woven in thread by means still of thread. It is thus the consistent way of ornamenting stuff, most consistent of all when one kind of thread is employed throughout, as in the case of linen upon linen, silk upon silk. The enrichment may, however, rightly be, and often as is perhaps, in a material nobler than the stuff enriched, in silk upon linen, in wool upon cotton, in gold upon velvet. The advisability of working upon a precious stuff in thread less precious is open to question. It does not seem to have been satisfactorily done, but if it were only the background that was worked, and the pattern were so schemed as almost to cover it, so that, in fact, very little of the more beautiful texture was sacrificed, and you had still a sumptuous pattern on a less attractive background, why not? But then it would be because you wanted that less precious texture there. The excuse of economy would scarcely hold good. In the case of a material in itself unsightly, the one course is to cover it entirely with stitching, as did the Persian and other untirable people of the East. But not they only. The famous Scion cope is so covered. much of the work so done, all over work that is to say, competes in effect with tapestry or other weaving, and its purpose was similar. It is a sort of amateur way of working your own stuff. But in character it is no more nearly related to the work of the loom than other needlework. It is still work on stuff, for all over embroidery one chooses naturally a coarse canvas ground to work on, but it more often happens that one chooses canvas because one means to cover it, than that one works all over a ground because it is unpresentable. Embroidery is merely an affair of stitching, and the first thing needful alike to the worker in it and the designer for it is a thorough acquaintance with the stitches. Not, of course, with every modification of a stitch which individual ingenuity may have devised. It would need the space of an encyclopedia to chronicle them all, but with the broadly marked varieties of stitch which have been employed to best purpose in ornament. They are derived naturally from the stitches first used for quite practical and prosaic purposes. Buttonhole stitch, for example, to keep the edges of the stuff from fraying. Herringbone, to strengthen and disguise a seam. Darning, to make good a worn surface, and so on. The difficulty of discussing them is greatly increased by the haphazard way in which they are commonly named. A stitch is called Greek, Spanish, Mexican, or what not, according to the country whence came the work in which someone first found it. Each names it after his or her individual discovery, or calls it perhaps vaguely Oriental, and so we have any number of names for the same stitch, names which to different people stand often for quite different stitches. When this confusion is complicated by the invention of a new name for every conceivable combination of thread strokes, or for each slightest variation upon an old stitch, and even for a stitch worked from left to right instead of from right to left, or for a stitch worked rather longer than usual, the task of reducing them to order seems almost hopeless. Nor do the quasi-learned descriptions of old stitches help us much. One reads about opus this and opus that until one begins to wonder where, amidst all this parade of science, art comes in. But you have not far to go in the study of the authorities to discover that, though they may concur in using certain high-sounding Latin terms, they are not of the same mind as to their meaning. In one thing they all agree, foreign writers as well as English, and that is as to the difficulty of identifying the stitch referred to by ancient writers, themselves probably not acquainted with the technique of stitching, and as likely as not to call it by a wrong name. It is easier, for example, to talk of opus Anglicanum than to say precisely what it was, further than that it described work done in England. And for that we have the simple word English. There is nothing to show that medieval English work contains stitches not used elsewhere. The stitches probably all come from the East. Nomenclature, then, is a snare. Why not drop titles and call stitches by the plainest and least mistakable names? It will be seen, if we reduce them to their native simplicity, that they fall into fairly marked groups or families, which can be discussed each under its own head. Stitches may be grouped in all manner of arbitrary ways, according to their provenance, according to their effect, according to their use, and so on. The most natural way of grouping them is according to their structure, not with regard to whence they came or what they do, but according to what they are, the way they are worked. This, at all events, is no arbitrary classification, and this is the plan it is proposed here to adopt. The use of such classification hardly needs pointing out. A survey of the stitches is the necessary preliminary either to the design or to the execution of needlework. How else suit the design to the stitch to the design? In order to do the one, the artist must be quite at home among the stitches. In order to do the other, the embroideress must have sympathy enough with the design to choose the stitch or stitches which will best render it. An artist who thinks the working out of his sketch none of his business is no practical designer. The worker who thinks design a thing apart from her is only a worker. This is not the moment to urge upon the needlewoman the study of design, but to urge upon the designer the study of stitches. Nothing is more impractical than to make a design without realizing the labor involved in its execution. Anyone not in sympathy with stitching may possibly design a beautiful piece of needlework, but no one will get all that is to be got out of the needle without knowing all about it. One must understand the ways in which work can be done in order to determine the way it shall in any particular case be done. Certain stitches answer certain purposes, and strictly only those. The designer must know which stitch answers which purpose, or he will in the first place waste the labor of the embroideress, and in the second miss his effect, which is to waste his own pains too. The effective worker, designer or embroiderer, is the one who works with judgment, and you cannot judge unless you know. When it is remembered that the character of needlework, and by rights also the character of its design, depends upon the stitch, there will be no occasion to insist further upon the necessity of a comprehensive survey of the stitches. A stitch may be defined as the thread left on the surface of the cloth or whatnot after each ply of the needle, and the simple, straightforward stitches of this kind are not so many as one might suppose. They may be reduced indeed to a comparatively few types, as will be seen in the following chapters. Canvas stitches. The simplest, as it is most likely the earliest used, stitch group is what might best be called canvas stitch, of which cross stitch is perhaps the most familiar type. The class of stitches which come of following, as it is only natural to do, the mesh of a coarse canvas, net, or open web upon which the work is done. A stitch bears always, or should bear, some relation to the material on which it is worked, but canvas or very coarse linen almost compels a stitch based upon the cross lines of its woof, and indeed suggests designs of equally rigid construction. That is so in embroidery, no matter where. In ancient Byzantine or Coptic work, in modern Cretan work, and in peasant embroidery all the world over, pattern work on coarse linen has run persistently into angular lines, in which, because of that very angularity, the plain outcome of a way of working, we find artistic character. Artistic design is always expressive of its mode of workmanship. Work of this kind is not too lightly to be dismissed. There is art in the rendering of form by means of angular outlines, art in the choice of forms which can be expressed by such lines. It is not uncharitable to surmise that one reason why such work, once so universal and now quite out of fashion, is not popular with needlewomen, may be the demand it makes upon the designer's draftsmanship. It is much easier, for example, to draw a stag than to render the creature satisfactorily within jagged lines determined by a linen mesh. The piquancy about natural or other forms thus reduced to angularity argues, of course, no affectation of quaintness on the part of the worker, but was the unavoidable outcome of her way of work. There is a pronounced and early limit to art of this rather naive kind, but that there is art in some of the very simplest and most modest peasant work built up on those lines, no artist will deny. The art in it is usually in proportion to its modesty. Nothing is more futile than to put it to anything like pictorial purpose. The wonderfully wrought pictures in tent stitch, for example, bequeathed to us by the 17th century, are painful object lessons in what not to do. The origin of the term cross-stitch is not far to seek. The stitches worked upon the square mesh do cross, but falling naturally into the lines of the mesh which governs them, they present not so much the appearance of crosses as of squares, reminding one of the tesserae employed in mosaic. To explain the process of working cross-stitch would be teaching one's grandmother indeed. It is simply, as its name implies, crossing one stitch by another, following always the lines of the canvas. But the important thing about it is that the stitches must cross always in the same way. And more than that, they must be worked in the same direction, or the mere fact that the stitches at the back of the work do not run in the same way will disturb the evenness of the surface. What looks like a seam on the sampler opposite is the result of filling up a gap in the ground with stitches necessarily worked in vertical, whereas the ground generally is in horizontal lines. On the face of the work, the stitches cross all in the same way. The common use of cross-stitch and the somewhat geometric kind of pattern to which it lends itself are shown in the sampler, illustration 5. The broad and simple leafage worked solid or left in the plain canvas upon a groundwork of solid stitching, and the fretted diaper on vertical and horizontal lines show the most straightforward ways of using it. The crisscross of alternating cross stitches and open canvas framed by the key pattern shows a means of getting something like a tint halfway between solid work and plain ground. The mere work line or stroke stitch, not crossed, is a perfectly fair way of getting a delicate effect, but the design has a way of working out rather less happily than it promised. The addition of such stroke stitches to solid cross stitch is not at best a very happy device. It strikes one always as a confession of dissatisfaction on the part of the worker with the simple means of her choice. As a device for, as it were, correcting the stepped outline, it is at its worst. Timid workers are always afraid of the stepped outline which a coarse mesh gives. In that they are wrong. One should employ canvas stitch only where there is no objection to a line which keeps step with the canvas. Then there is a positive charm, for frank people at least, in the frank confession of the way the work is done. There are many degrees in the frankness with which this convention has been accepted, according perhaps to the coarseness of the canvas ground, perhaps to the personality of the worker. The animal forms at the top of illustration 6 are uncompromisingly square. The floral devices on the same page, though they fall, as it were, inevitably into square lines, are less rigidly formal. The inevitableness of the square line is apparent in the sprig below. It was evidently meant to be freely drawn, but the influence of the mesh betrays itself, and the design, if it loses something in grace, gains also thereby in character. There is literally no end to the variety of stitches, as they are called, belonging to this group, and their names are a babel of confusion. Florentine, Parisian, Hungarian, Spanish, Moorish, Cashmere, Milanese, Gobelin are only a few of them, but they stand as a rule rather for stitch arrangements than for stitches. A small selection of them is given in illustration 8. What is known as tent stitch, A in the sampler opposite, is a sort of half cross stitch. Its peculiarity is that it covers only one thread of the canvas at a stroke, and is therefore on a more minute scale than stitches which are 2 or 3 threads wide, as cross stitch may and cushion stitch must be. It derives its name from the old word tenture or tenter, from tendere, to stretch, the frame on which the embroideress distended her canvas. The word has gone out of use, but we still speak of tenterhooks. The stitch is serviceable enough in its way, but is discredited by the monstrous abuse of it referred to already. A picture in tent stitch is even more foolish than a picture in mosaic. It cannot come anywhere near to pictorial effect. The tesserae will pronounce themselves and spoil it. This kind of half-cross stitch worked on the larger scale of ordinary cross stitch would look meager. It is filled out, therefore, by horizontal lines of the thread laid across the canvas, and over these the stitch is worked. Cushion stitch consists of diagonal lines of upright stitches, measuring in the sampler shown 6 threads of the canvas, so that after each stitch the needle may be brought out, just 3 threads lower than where it was put in. By working in zigzag instead of diagonal lines, a familiar pattern is produced, more often described as Florentine, but the stitch is in any case the same. The stitch shown at D in the sampler, sometimes called Moorish stitch, is begun by working a row of short vertical stitches, slightly apart, and completed by diagonal stitches joining them. Unless the silk employed is full and soft, this may not completely cover the canvas, in which case the diagonal stitches must further be crossed, as shown on illustration 89. If the linen is loosely woven and the thread is tightly drawn in the working, the mesh is pulled apart, giving the effect of an open lattice of the kind shown at B on illustration 10, in which the threads of the linen are not drawn out but drawn together. The way of working the stitch shown at E is described on page 51 under the name of fishbone. Worked on canvas, it has somewhat the effect of plaiting and goes by the name of plait stitch. It is worked in horizontal rows, alternately from left to right and from right to left. The stitch at F is a sort of couching. Diagonal lines of thread are first laid from edge to edge of the ground space, and these are sewn down by short overcasting stitches in the cross direction. Admirable canvas stitch work has been done upon linen in silk of one color, red, green, or blue, and it was common practice to work the background, leaving the pattern in the bare stuff. It prevailed in countries lying far apart, though probably not without intercommunication. In fact, the influence of Oriental work upon European has been so great that even experts hesitate sometimes to say whether a particular piece of work is Turkish or Italian. In Italian work, at least, it was usual to get over the angularity of silhouette inherent in canvas stitches by working an outline separately. When that is thin, the effect is proportionately feeble. The broader outline, shown at A, illustration 10, justifies itself, and in the case of a stitch which falls into horizontal lines, it appears to be necessary. This is plait stitch, known also by the name of Spanish stitch, not that it is in any way peculiar to Spain. It is allied to herringbone stitch, to which a special chapter is devoted. Darning is also employed as a canvas stitch. There is beautiful 16th century Italian work in colored silks on dark net of the very open square mesh of the period, which is most effective, and in which there is no pretense of disguising the stepped outline. And in the very early days of Christian art in Egypt and Byzantium, linen was darned in little square tufts of wool upstanding on its surface, which look so much like the tesserae of mosaic that it seems as if they must have been worked in deliberate imitation of it. Again, in the 15th century, satin stitch was worked on fine linen with strict regard to the lines of its web, and the Persians, ancient and modern, embroider white silk upon linen, also in satin stitch, preserving piously the rectangular and diagonal lines given by the material. They have their reward in producing most characteristic needlework. The diapered ground in illustration 9 is satin stitch upon coarse linen. The filling-in patterns used to such delicate and dainty purpose in the marvelous work on fine cambric, which competes in effect with lace, though it is strictly embroidery, all follow in their design the lines of the fabric, and are worked thread by thread according to its woof. They afford again instances of perfect adaptation of stitch to material and of design to stitch. Satin and other stitches were worked by the old Italians, as shown in illustration 3, on square meshed canvas, frankly on the square lines given by it, for the filling in of ornamental details, though the outline might be much less formal. That is to say, the surface of freely drawn leaves, etc., instead of being worked solid, was diapered over with more or less open pattern work constructed on the lines of the weaving. A cunning use of the square mesh of canvas has sometimes been made to guide the worker upon the fabrics, such as velvet. This was first faced with net. The design was then worked over that, onto and into the velvet, and the threads of the canvas were then drawn out. That is a device which may serve on occasion. The design may even be traced upon the net. Crewel stitch. For work in the hand, crewel stitch is perhaps on the whole the easiest and most useful of stitches, whence it comes that people sometimes vaguely call all embroidery crewel work, though as a matter of fact, the stitch properly so called was never very commonly employed, even when the work was done in crewel, the double thread of twisted wool from which it takes its name. Crewel stitch proper is shown at A on the sampler opposite, where it is used for line work. It is worked as follows. Having made a start in the usual way, keep your thread downwards under your left thumb and below your needle, that is, to the right. Then take up with the needle, say 1/8 of an inch of the stuff, and bring it out through the hole made in starting the stitch, taking care not to pierce the thread. This gives the first half stitch. If you proceed in the same way, your next stitch will be full length. The test of good workmanship is that at the back it should look like backstitch, shown in illustration 12 and described on page 30. Outline stitch, B on the sampler, differs from crewel stitch only in that the thread is always kept upwards above the needle, that is, to the left. In so doing, the thread is apt to untwist itself and wants constantly retwisting. The stitch is useful for single lines and for outlining solid work. The muddled effect of much crewel work is due to the confusion of this stitch with crewel stitch proper. Thick crewel stitch, C on the sampler, is only a little wider than ordinary crewel stitch, but gives a heavier line in higher relief. In effect, it resembles rope stitch, but it is more simply worked. You begin as an ordinary crewel stitch, but after the first half stitch, you take up 1/8 of an inch of the material in advance of the last stitch, and bring out your needle at the point where the first half stitch began. You proceed, always putting your needle in 1/8 of an inch in front of, and bringing it out 1/8 of an inch behind the last stitch, so as to have always 1/4 an inch of the stuff on your needle. Thick outline stitch, D on the sampler, is like thick crewel stitch, with the exception that, as an ordinary outline stitch, you keep your thread always above the needle to the left. In back stitch, E, instead of first bringing the needle out at the point where the embroidery is to begin, you begin it out 1/8 of an inch in advance of it. Then putting your needle back, you take up this 1/8 inch together with another 1/8 in advance. For the next stitch, you put your needle into the hole made by the last stitch, and so on, taking care not to split the last thread in so doing. To work the spots, shown as F on the sampler, having made a back stitch, bring your needle out through the same hole as before, and make another back stitch above it, so that you have, in what appears to be one stitch, 2 thicknesses of thread. Then bring your needle out some distance in advance of the last stitch, and proceed as before. The distance between the stitches is determined by the effect you desire to produce. The thread should not be drawn too tight. You begin stem stitch, G, with the usual half stitch. Then holding the thread downwards, instead of proceeding as in crewel stitch, you slant your needle so as to bring it out a thread or 2 higher up than the half stitch, but precisely above it. You next put the needle in 1/8 of an inch in advance of the last stitch, bring it out again in a slanting direction a thread or 2 higher. At the back of the work, shown in illustration 12, the stitches lie in a slanting direction. To work wider stem stitch, H, After the first 2 stitches, bring your needle out precisely above and in a line with them, and put it in again 1/8 of an inch in advance of the last stitch, producing a longer stroke, which gives the measure of those following. The slanting stitches at the back shown in illustration 12 are only 2/3 of the length of those on the face. Crewel and outline stitches, J, worked side by side, give somewhat the effect of a braid. The importance of not confusing them already referred to is here apparent. Crewel stitch is worked solid in the heart shape in the center of the sampler. On the left side, the rows of stitching follow the outline of the heart. On the right, they are more upright, merely conforming a little to the shape to be filled. This is the better method. The way to work solid crewel stitch will be best explained by an instance. Suppose a leaf to be worked. You begin by outlining it. If it is a wide leaf, you further work a center line where the main rib would be, and then work row within row of stitches until the space is filled. If on arriving at the point of your leaf, instead of going round the edge, you work back by the side of the first row of stitching, there results a streakiness of texture apparent in the stem on illustration 13. What you get is, in effect, a combination of crewel and outline stitches, as at J, which in the other case only occurs in the center of the shape where the files of stitches meet. To represent shading in crewel stitch, to which it is admirably suited, as shown in illustration 41, it is well to work from the darkest shadows to the highest lights, and it is expedient to map out on the stuff the outline of the space to be covered by each shade of thread. There is no difficulty then in working round that shape, as above explained. In solid crewel, the stitches should quite cover the ground without pressing too closely one against the other. It does not seem that English women of the 17th century were ever very faithful to the stitch we know by the name of crewel. Old examples of work done entirely in crewel stitch, as distinguished from what is called crewel work, are seldom if ever to be met with. The stitch occurs in most of the old English embroidery in wool, but it is astonishing when one comes to examine the quilts and curtains of a couple of 100 years or so ago, how very little of the wool work on them is in crewel stitch. The detail on illustration 13 was chosen because it contained more of it than any other equal portion of a handsome and typical English hanging. But it is only in the main stem and in some of the outlines that the stitch is used, and what appears to have been the prevailing practice, to use crewel stitch for stems and outlines, and for little else but the very simplest forms. The filling in of the leafage, the diapering within the leaf shapes, and the smaller and more elaborate details generally were done in long and short stitch, or whatever came handiest. In fact, the thing to be represented, fruit, berry, flower, or whatnot, seems to have suggested the stitch, which it must be confessed was sometimes only a sort of scramble to get an effect. Of course, the artist always chooses her stitch, and she is free to alter it as occasion may demand. But a good workwoman, and the embroideress is a needlewoman first, and an artist afterwards perhaps, adopts in every case a method, and departs from it only for very good reason. It looks as if our ancestors had set to work without system or guiding principle at all. No doubt they got a bold and striking effect in their bed hangings and the like, but there is in their work a lack of that conscious aim which goes to make art. Theirs is art of the rather artless sort, which is just now so popular. Happily, it was kept in the way it should go by a strict adherence to traditional pattern, which for the time being seems to have gone completely out of fashion. Quite in the traditional manner is illustration 14. One would fancy at first sight that the work was almost entirely in crewel stitch. As a matter of fact, there is little which answers to the name, as an examination of the back of the work shows plainly enough. What the stitches are, it is not easy to say. The mystery of many a stitch is to be unraveled only by literally picking out the threads, which one is not always at liberty to do, although in the ardor of research a keen embroideress will do it, not without remorse in the case of beautiful work, but relentlessly all the same. The only piece of embroidery entirely in crewel stitch which I could find for illustration 15 is worked as it happens in silk, nor was the worker aware that in so working she was doing anything out of the common. Another instance of crewel stitch is given in the divided skirt, let us call it, of the personage in illustration 72. Beautiful backstitching occurs in the Italian work on illustration 89, and the stitch is used for sewing down the applique in illustration 94. And with that conclusion of the chapter, I think we'll end this evening's reading from Art in Needlework, a book about embroidery, which was much more interesting than I had expected it to be, as is so often the case. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to read this work for yourself and see the many illustrations and diagrams, which I highly recommend to anyone actually interested in embroidery, as always you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.